Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned the West against interfering in Ukraine. He said he would unleash retaliatory strikes against what he called any unacceptable strategic threats. And he said Moscow has the means to carry out these strikes. In the speech to Russian lawmakers, he also accused the U.S. of inflaming the conflict by sending arms to Ukraine.
If anyone from outside moves to interfere in the current developments and creates unacceptable strategic threats for Russia, they should know that our response to encounter these assaults will be lightning fast. It will be quick. We have all the tools for this, the kind that no one else can boast of right now.
So what to make of President Putin's comments? DW has spoken with Justin Crump from the global risk analysis consultancy, Sybil Line. Here's his assessment.
I mean, this is not the first time that Russians have made statements along these lines, of course. They've raised this numerous times since the start of the conflict. And there's a repeat each time of a reaction to the Western supply of weapons. Now, that Western supply of weapons is becoming more obvious. You know, there's larger equipment being provided. There's more signature equipment being provided. It's no longer just defensive. So I'm certain that Russia is increasingly being frustrated by this, but they're still responding by strikes within Ukraine. They haven't escalated the conflict yet outside of Ukraine. But I think the rhetoric will eventually have to be followed by action. And maybe that's what we're seeing with the imposition of restrictions on Poland and Bulgaria in regard to gas, potentially operations in cyberspace and other areas where Russia can start to extend the conflict and express its continued discontent at the fact that this support for Ukraine is, of course, helping to hinder Russia's progress on the battlefield.
Now, Russia has been making military gains in the east and south of Ukraine. Ukraine's defense ministry says Russian troops have captured several towns in the eastern Donbas region. In the besieged city of Mariupol, residents are facing increasingly desperate conditions.
In the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, people sing for a passage to safety for their fellow citizens in Mariupol. But inside the besieged city, ordinary people do what they can to carry on, queuing for hours for their pensions as money runs out.
We came to the pension fund to get in line, to register for our pensions, because money has run out. The salaries of pensioners who used to work have stopped.
A Ukrainian commander inside the city's surrounded steelworks said hundreds of injured civilians remain trapped.
In our group, there are more than 600 wounded to various degrees. They badly need help. Here, the conditions are not good. There's no medicine, no personnel who could help them. We have wounded civilians. We help them as much as we can.
Protesters clashed with Russian forces in the occupied city of Kherson after the former mayor was reappointed by the Russians. The protesters' message to their occupiers was clear: go home. Close to the front lines, in the eastern city of Kyiv, it's a daily struggle to survive with what little they have. Many are living in cramped basements. The strain on their mental health is clear. May God end this war, she says. We are all going to end up in a mental hospital. All of us here are struggling. Below Kyiv, metro stations now places where children play. A new life below the city, away from the dangers of Russian bombs.
Let's bring in our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, who joins me now from Borodyanka. Rebecca, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is in Ukraine. He's going to be meeting President Zelenskyy later, and you will be following that for us. Can you tell us what is on the agenda today?
Yes, Claire, we're in Borodyanka, one of the cities outside Kyiv, northwest of Kyiv, that was really badly damaged, was occupied by the Russians for around about a month. President Zelenskyy and Antonio Guterres will be visiting this city as well as the other cities nearby, Irpin and Bucha, quite well known by now. I believe they are just arriving any moment. So we'll be taking a tour of these three cities before heading back to Kyiv, where the two men will meet and discuss what's on their agenda, and then we'll be having a press conference later on, so we'll be able to tell you what came out of that meeting.
Now, Guterres has also, of course, just met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Very little achieved in that meeting. Is there hope there that this visit to Ukraine will make any sort of difference?
Well, that all depends on what you mean by hope there, Claire. I mean, if their hope is that this will come to some sort of peace agreement, then I'd have to say definitely not. But the other hope and the other thing that was on the agenda was the talk of trying to open a humanitarian corridor in that besieged city of Mariupol to allow for the remaining soldiers and civilians to be evacuated out of that Azovstal plant. If that was discussed with President Zelenskyy and Antonio Guterres arriving in Borodyansk as we speak. You can see the UN vehicles there and the convoy. But just to get back to the question, the humanitarian corridor in Mariupol, that was discussed with President Putin. It's something he agreed with in principle, but, you know, it will be on the agenda again today with President Zelenskyy, and there is hope that that may be successful, but that still remains to be seen, Claire.
And so we're coming to tour these locations. You're seeing them arriving there behind you. Can you tell us a little bit more about this situation in Mariupol? Because in his meeting with Guterres, Putin did agree in principle to evacuations from that steel plant in Mariupol, where we know there are roughly 1,000 civilians, also Ukrainian fighters holed up. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the situation actually looks like there at the moment?
Well, there hasn't been much change, unfortunately. No good news to report there. The fighting is ongoing as far as we know. The latest we heard was from yesterday. It's very hard to get real-time information out of that besieged city, as you can imagine. But what we have been hearing is that shelling continues, the fighting is continuing, and there is no plan. It doesn't look like the ceasefire will hold in order to evacuate those civilians. So, unfortunately, the situation remains the same in Mariupol. But let's see what happens after this visit and after today's discussion with Antonio Guterres.
And as we go into these discussions, can you tell us how things are looking on the ground in terms of Russia's territorial gains? Have they been holding the majority of the areas that they have taken?
They have been able to hold that front line, Claire. You know, as we know that the Russians are trying to push in the east and the south, and they're trying to encircle Ukrainian troops there in the Donbass region. They have, you know, there's been gains and losses on both sides, but minor, and the front line is really not moving very fast at all. As we know, there are more weapons now coming in for the Ukrainian side, and there's definitely a hope there that with that extra heavy weaponry, they'll be able to not just hold the front line, but actually push the Russians out of their territory. But once again, that remains to be seen. At the moment, front line moving very slowly.
Okay, we're just seeing briefly some live pictures of Guterres arriving there. We are going to leave it there, though. Now that's our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, who's been joining us from Borodyanka. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time. The European leaders have criticized Russia's decision to cut natural gas deliveries to Poland and Bulgaria as blackmail. They said the cutoff, along with the Kremlin's warning that it might cease shipments to other countries, was an attempt to divide the West over its support for Ukraine. The leaders stressed that this would fail.
Russia's latest move in the conflict goes beyond the battlefield in Ukraine to the gas pipelines into Europe. In what has been seen as an aggressive move, Russia has cut the gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria. Russian energy giant Gazprom said it had turned off the gas tap to the two EU and NATO members after not receiving payment in rubles. The Kremlin demanded that bills be paid in its own currency as a response to international sanctions, which left it unable to utilize foreign currency and its own reserves. Those immediately affected were quick to respond. The Polish Prime Minister declared his country was energy safe, having built up reserves, and implied that Poland's preparations, including an alternative Baltic pipeline, might help the EU wean itself off Russian energy. Let me remind you that we have interconnectors to Germany and the Czech Republic, as well as our gas terminal in Świnoujście, which can receive even larger amounts of liquefied gas. So we will try to rise to the occasion in this difficult time. Bulgaria, a country almost totally reliant on Russia's gas, looked to the EU for solidarity and security. I spoke with Ursula von der Leyen, who said that a unilateral breach of the agreement between Gazprom and Bulgaria is not just a problem for Bulgaria. This is a problem for the whole of the EU, and the response will be united. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, accused Russia on Twitter of attempting to blackmail the EU with gas. Germany's economy minister, Robert Habeck, said Berlin needs to make sure it learns from the crisis. It would be cynical if big and powerful Germany thought, oh well, you can beat up the little guys a little bit. That's a warning for you. No, this is reality. This is the reality where energy is used as a weapon, and we have to make sure we are not defenseless when energy is used as a weapon. We need to diversify our energy infrastructure accordingly and focus our energy infrastructure around renewable energy and massive savings so that we are not defenseless. Meanwhile, Russia could decide to cool down relations even further. It has stated that gas shutoffs to other EU countries could be in the pipeline.
Now, Western and Ukrainian sources estimate that well over 10,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in the conflict in Ukraine. But Moscow has only admitted to the deaths of around 1,500 troops. As families across Russia bury their dead, the Kremlin is telling the Russians that the war, or special operation as they call it, is needed to protect the country's borders. We report now from the city of Volgograd, which was formerly known as Stalingrad.
Dmitry was just 19 years old. Ivan, 21. Every week, more and more graves are being dug in this cemetery in Volgograd, mostly for young soldiers who died in their president's so-called special military operation.
These young people should be able to enjoy their lives. They still had their whole lives ahead of them. No one needs war, especially not ordinary people. We do not hate the Ukrainians at all. People are dying on both sides, but what can you do? Look here how the poor man lies there.
Every day, families are grieving in Russia, usually in places far from Moscow, like here in Vladikavkaz, in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains. In the city of Volgograd, along with the cries of grief, justification for the war can also be heard.
It is very painful, but it's necessary. There has to be victims. God is with us. We will triumph.
Viktor Shestel fought in the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War. He's aware Russia is again seeing fallen soldiers, but nevertheless supports President Vladimir Putin's actions. It's very painful that they are dying, but Russia has to defend its borders and keep Ukraine out of NATO. At this cemetery, friends and relatives of 26-year-old Andrei have gathered to say a final farewell. He was also killed fighting in Ukraine. As the Kremlin continues to champion fallen soldiers as a price worth paying for Putin's war.